Well, good morning. Good to see everybody here today. We are in the fifth week of a sermon series that we're doing called Balance. This is a sermon series we're borrowing from Andy Stanley at North Point Church. And what we're doing in this sermon series is we're talking about how we can find and maintain balance when it comes to our finances. And over the last 4 weeks, this is the fifth week, we've talked about a lot of things. And if you've missed one of the weeks along the way, let me encourage you, you can go back and you can actually find it on crosswaychurch.com or crossway.news, or you can go to our YouTube channel and kind of catch up or pick up something that you missed. And we talked about a lot of great things. And if you missed one, let me encourage you, go back and do that. But today, actually for the last few weeks, we've been talking about corrections when it comes to your finances. And the first correction we talked about is consumer debt. And if you're in consumer debt, large or small, we said, man, if you're going to stay balanced, you got to get out of debt. And then last week we talked about generosity. And today I want to talk about a correction that perhaps many of us need to make in regards to our spending. Specifically, I want to talk about the demographic, or the dynamic really, the dynamic that drives and fuels not just our economy, but it drives and fuels all of our overspending. The thing we're going to talk about today, the dynamic we're going to talk about today, it was the thing that caused some of you to get involved in a lease that you don't like. For some of you, it was the thing that caused you to get involved in purchasing a house that's more house than you need. For some of you, it's the reason why you have credit card debt. For some of you, it's the reason why you purchased something that by the time you even finished paying for it, you didn't know where it is, or it was broken, or you didn't like it anymore, and maybe you even traded it out to get something newer and bigger, better, faster, shinier, and you're now making payments on that. But the thing we're going to talk about, the dynamic we're going to talk about, is what fuels all of that stuff that sometimes gets us into financial trouble. And the thing I want to talk about this morning is something called discontentment. Discontentment, whether you know it or not, is what fuels and drives your overspending. So here's a working definition. Discontentment is ultimately the dissatisfaction I have with what I have. Discontentment is the dissatisfaction you have with what you have. And there's a term that I would like you to closely associate with discontentment. And if you turn me off and you kind of tune me out the rest of everything that I say today, I want you to know this is probably worth it for you, because these two terms and how closely connected they are will explain so much that's going on in your life. But the term I want you to connect with discontentment is this one: awareness. Because it's awareness that drives and fuels discontentment, which in turn drives and fuels your overspending. And maybe you've experienced this. Perhaps for some of you, you've experienced the power of awareness in this way. Maybe it had something to do with a home. Maybe you had a home that you liked, a home that you enjoyed. Man, you just felt like, man, this thing is a blessing from God. I'm just so fortunate to have a home. It meets my needs. It meets the needs of my family. And you were fine with your home. Maybe even you liked it until one day you sat down and you watched some HGTV. And then you saw Chip and Joanna come on, and they're doing their thing, and they get this couple, and the couple purchases this ragged out old home that doesn't look like it has much potential. And then they start going to work on it. You're not really sure how this thing's going to turn out, but you're sure Chip and Joanna can turn this thing around. And then you wait until the end, and there's that big reveal, and they pull that thing back, and along with the couple, you're going, no way. And they walk you through the house, and you're going, oh my gosh, look at that shiplap. Shiplap's amazing. It looks so good. And all I have is sheetrock. And then they start, you go to the kitchen, you're like, oh, I didn't even know kitchens could look like that. That's incredible. My kitchen's just sort of vanilla. And then they take you to the bathrooms, and you're like, oh my word, if my bathroom looked like that, I would live in it. Like, that's the only place that I would go. Oh my gosh. And all of a sudden, the house that you used to be so grateful for, you start thinking, man, I'm not sure, maybe I need to get a new house, or maybe I need to get some upgrades, or maybe I need to make some changes. And it all was fueled by awareness, right? Maybe you had a friend, maybe you had a car, for instance, a car that you liked, and it wasn't the nicest car around, but it got you from point A to point B. It started every time you turned the key, and it had air conditioning that works, which is pretty critical in Mississippi, Like, if you're going to have a car that has air conditioning that works, that gets you point A to point B, that's a good car. And maybe you had a car like that, and maybe you were grateful for it. God, look, this thing's so grateful. It gets me from where I need to go and takes care of the needs of my family. And you were fine with it until that day when you had a friend who bought a new car. And they call you up and they say, hey, come check this out. And you didn't want to be a killjoy, so you drove over there and oh my goodness, it looked so good. And then when you open the door, there's this new car smell that wafted out at you. And as you smelled it, as you took it in, you thought, I didn't know cars, I forgot they smelled like that. That's incredible. And then you start looking throughout the car, you see, man, there's no spots, there's no stains. Look how clean it is. And you think about the mess that your kids made in the back of your car and how it's probably not coming out. And then you're like, oh man, this is so much nicer. And then you get into the car and you start playing around and you discover it has features that you didn't even know existed. Like you're like, what? Cars do that? They'll make a meal and feed it to me? That's incredible. And all of a sudden, the car that you used to be so grateful for is something that now you're like, no, I don't know. Maybe I need to look into getting a new car. And all of us have had a moment like that, haven't we? A moment when we encountered something bigger, better, faster, stronger, newer, shinier, whatever. And we had that moment where we go in, oh, I didn't know about that. And we had to have it. And we become consumed with it. And you go, oh man, how do I get it? How do I get it? How do I get it? And you become dissatisfied, right? And what fuels all of that is awareness. Because you were fine until you knew or found out that there was something newer. Awareness fuels dissatisfaction, which fuels our overspending. Now, what makes all of this such a powerful thing in our culture is that there are people who spend a lot of money and do a tremendous amount of research. And this is more true now than it has ever been. But they spend a lot of money and they do a lot of research to try to get us to be constantly aware of the things that we don't have. And they're really good at it. Now, what's interesting, too, is that in past generations, people would replace things. They would replace things if they got old, if they wore out. They would replace things if they broke. They would replace things if they lost them. But we don't replace things anymore, do we? You know what we do? We upgrade. That's what we do. Because of the awareness that drives our dissatisfaction, which drives our spending. So we don't wait. We don't wait until something's worn out. We don't wait till something's broken. We don't wait till it's lost. We just have this upgrade mentality that we live with. And this upgrade mentality, what it does is it makes it very easy for our dissatisfaction to be fueled by our awareness. Now, in the middle of all this stuff, this dynamic that we're talking about that drives our overspending, there's a twist in all of it. And the twist is this, the thing that we don't expect, the thing that maybe we don't think about, is that our desire for stuff, our drive for more, our hunger for bigger, better, stronger, faster, newer, shinier, all of that is an appetite. Now, you may not be used to thinking about it in those terms, but it's an appetite. And just like every appetite, it's never fully and finally satisfied. When you and I sit down to eat a meal at lunch here in a few minutes, we don't expect to be fully and finally satisfied. We expect to be temporarily satisfied, right? We know the appetite is going to come back. And your pursuit of more, your pursuit of stuff, that drive for stuff, that drive for upgrades and new and all this sort of thing, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, it is an appetite that's never fully and finally satisfied. That's why some of you bought a house and you went, man, this is the house. Maybe you spent more on it than you thought you would. Maybe it's finally, I got my dream home, and you thought, maybe you even said it out loud, I'm never getting another home. This is it. I'm going to die in this home. And then you went and bought another house sometime down the road. Because it's an appetite. It's never fully and finally satisfied. This is why some of you did the same thing with a car. You finally got the dream car, that really nice car, the one you've been working for, saving for. Maybe you didn't, maybe you financed it or whatever it is, and you got it and you said to yourself, oh my goodness, this is it. I'm going to drive this thing till the wheels fall off. And then a couple of years later, what'd you do? You went and bought a new car, right? Because it's an appetite. Now, common sense, or at least what we would think is common sense, almost tells us that the way that you deal with an appetite is you feed it. You feed an appetite. But the problem is that that's not the way that appetites work. When you feed appetites, they don't go away. They become greater and greater and greater and greater. When you feed an appetite, it grows. No matter what it is in your life that's categorically an appetite, that's the way that appetites work in every arena of life. You feed it, it grows. Now, here's the counterintuitive part. The way that you lessen or diminish an appetite is actually by starving it. If you starve an appetite, that's how you lessen or diminish an appetite. For those of us who fasted more than 5 to 10 days, which is probably like one or two of us, but for those of us who fasted that long, you know this is true. Because at first, your appetite's raging, and then the further you go into it, what happens is that appetite, because it's been starved, you start to feel less and less hungry, and your desire for food lessens and lessens and lessens. Now, your body still needs nutrition, but your appetite has diminished. Now, again, what our culture does is it tells us it's an appetite. Feed it, feed it, feed it, feed it, feed it, feed it. But the best way to diminish it is to starve it. Now, in the middle of all of this is another thought I want you to wrestle with. Discontentment has driven many of your financial decisions, potentially. Potentially, most of us, if not all of us, can look back to a purchase we made that was driven because of discontentment, and we went, oh, and there's some regret around it. But the thing is that discontentment isn't always bad. Discontentment can sometimes be leveraged for good. There are a lot of things that have happened in our world that are good because somebody or a group of somebodies became discontent around it. For instance, the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement occurred and happened because there were some people who decided, you know what, racism is not okay. It's not okay that people get treated that way. We're all God's children. It's not okay to get treated that way. And they rose up and they did something about it, and our world is better today because of it. There are organizations in our world that feed the hungry, that house the homeless, that help people with addictions, and all of that happened because somewhere along the line, there was somebody or a group of somebodies who became incredibly dissatisfied. They said, you know what, it's not okay that people who are hungry go without food. It's not okay that people sleep out in just wherever and they don't have a home. It's not okay that addiction ravages people's lives. We're going to do something about it. Maybe even in your own life, your life has been bettered because of discontentment. For some of you here today, it's possible that you have a great marriage today because long ago, you became discontent about the direction that your marriage was going. And you just decided, you know what? This isn't right. It's not okay, and I'm not going to let it ride. For some of you, you're healthy today because somewhere in your past, you realized, man, this path is taking me to a place I don't want to go, and I'm not okay with it, and I'm going to do something about it. You see, dissatisfaction, it's not always bad, or discontentment, it's not always bad. Now, with all that as the backdrop, what I want to do is I want to take a look at a passage of Scripture in 1 Timothy chapter 6. So if you have a Bible or a Bible app on your mobile device, if you want to turn with me, we'll be in 1 Timothy chapter 6. If you don't have either of those or any of those, don't worry about it. We're going to put all this stuff up on the screens for you so that you can follow along. But 1 Timothy is actually a letter that was written by a guy named Paul to a young man that he was mentoring named Timothy. And Paul didn't call the letter 1 Timothy. There's actually another letter called 2 Timothy First and Second Timothy were labels that people put on it later on so that we could distinguish between the two letters. But in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul is mentoring Timothy, and he's talking to him about wealth and wealthy people and people who want to get wealthy. And in the middle of all of that, he talks to him about contentment and discontentment and the stuff that you and I are talking about. So what I want to do is I want to drop right down in the middle of the conversation and take a look at what Paul says about this whole dynamic that we're talking about. Here's what Paul says. He says, but godliness with contentment, and that's our word, right? Our godliness with contentment is great gain. Now, when Paul says great gain here, he's not referring to the type of thing that you and I normally think of as great gain. We think of great gain as bigger house, nicer cars, cooler toys, newer gadgets, all that sort of stuff. We think about great gain in terms of upgrading. But what Paul is doing is he's contrasting what you and I normally think of great gain, and he's suggesting to Timothy, look, Timothy, I want you to pause for a minute here, and what I want you to do is consider redefining great gain. I want you to just rethink what great gain is. And Paul urges Timothy, here's how I want you to think about great gain. It's godliness with contentment. It's godliness. So godliness it's when we surrender our lives to God. It's when we become who God wants us to become and we do what God wants us to do. It's surrendering our lives and doing God's will. So godliness along with contentment. And contentment is essentially when you and I look around the world and we become aware of somebody else or something else that somebody has or something else that's out there in the world, and we go, oh, that's cool, that's neat, didn't know that was even out there. Hey, good for you, but I'm content with what I have. And Paul urges Timothy, look, redefine great gain. Define it this way, godliness with contentment. Now, in the next verse, Paul continues, and he says, for. And by the way, anytime you find a verse in the Bible that starts with for, what it means is the person, whoever wrote this, is about to explain further what they just said. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. Translation, here's what Paul's saying. He's saying, look, life can't equal stuff. Because if life equals stuff, then what happens is we accumulate a bunch of stuff that we don't take with us in the next life. If life equals stuff, and if we allow our life to be defined by the pursuit of stuff, then what happens is when it's all said and done, we'll have nothing to show for it. Because we're not taking anything with us. In the next verse, he continues and he says, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Paul says, look, godliness with contentment. If we can find a way to get to the place where if we have food and if we have clothes and a place to lay our head, along with godliness, then we'll be content. Now, I don't know about you, but the first time I heard Paul, and I read this, what Paul said here, there's a part of me, the spiritual part of me that wants to go, oh yeah, absolutely true, preach on, brother. But there's the other part of me that goes, I don't know about that. Paul, are you serious? Are you telling me if I have something to eat, if I have a shirt on my back and a place to lay my head, then contentment can be found there? There's just a part of us, and when we're really honest, that absolutely isn't totally convinced that what Paul is saying here is true. At least I wasn't initially, until I started asking myself the question, when in my life have I been the most content? Because I don't know how it is in your life right now, but I'm at a place in life where I've never had more stuff than I've ever had before. I mean, it's ridiculous. I walk through my house and I find myself thinking, where did I get all this stuff? Like, why do we have all this stuff? This is ridiculous. And then when I look at the way that I spend my time and energy, I spend a tremendous amount of time cleaning my stuff, organizing my stuff, maintaining my stuff. I mean, I've never had more stuff than I have now. But you know when I was most content? I was most content when I had almost nothing. It was probably when Stacy and I were first married. When we were first married, we got this we got this one-bedroom apartment, and it was T90. You couldn't hardly turn around without bumping into somebody. It was maybe 600 square feet. And we didn't even have enough furniture to furnish the whole thing. And half of the furniture we had was old and secondhand, and it had holes in it, and it was worn out. We didn't make hardly any money back then, and we had almost nothing to our name. We had this car that at the time we thought, man, this thing's awesome. But I look back on it and I'm like, man, that thing was a piece of junk. But in spite of all of that, that's when I look back on my life, that's when I was the most content. And I have a sneaking suspicion the same is probably true for you too. And the reason why that's true is because the pursuit of stuff promises us stuff that it doesn't deliver. Stuff doesn't actually bring true, real, meaningful life. So what Paul suggests to Timothy is he says, look, what you need to do is you need to redefine great gain. Instead of defining it as stuff, define it as godliness with contentment, because Paul, he insists, look, here's what I've learned. If I have godliness along with food and clothes and a place to lay my head, I end up being more content than people who have more stuff. Which is a pretty deep and important thought, isn't it? And it runs completely in the face of the culture that we live in. Paul continues, he says, those who want to get rich. Now this phrase, those who want to get rich, can also be translated, those who want to live richly. He's saying those who want to live as if they're rich, or those who want to live a rich-oriented kind of life. When Paul says those who want to live richly, you know who he's talking about? You and me. He's talking about those of us who get enamored by newer, bigger, better, faster, stronger, shinier. He's talking about those of us who somehow believe a house and a new car and some new hunting gear will make us happy. And that's what life is made of. He says, those who want to live richly fall into a temptation and a trap. And I think it's important that we stop here and we recognize that Paul doesn't say you might fall into a trap. What he says is, no, this absolutely will happen. All of us who want to live richly, that live our life with an orientation around more and an orientation around stuff, will fall into a trap. And again, some of us know what this is like because some of us are involved in a lease that we don't like. Some of us in this room, we have a house that we can't pay for, not because of a change in income, but because of a bad financial decision. Some of us have credit cards that we absolutely can't pay. And why is that true? Well, it's true because we fell into a trap. And even if that hasn't happened to you personally, you've seen this happen in our world, right? Because we all know people, or we know of people, who were extraordinarily rich. I mean, they made millions upon millions of dollars. And then one day we find out that they've gone bankrupt, and we stand back and we scratch our heads and we go, well, how did that happen? The answer is, they fell into a trap. Well, TJ, what do the traps look like? I don't know. If we knew what they look like, they wouldn't be very good traps, would they? All I know is that for those of us who want to live richly, if our life is defined by more, Paul's abundantly clear, we fall into a trap. He continues, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Here's what Paul's saying. He's saying discontentment is dangerous. Discontentment is dangerous. It'll cost us. And this is true of you, and it's true of me, no matter what our socioeconomic status is. This is true if you're poor. This is true if you're middle class. This is true if you're kind of rich. And this is true if you're richy rich rich. There's a whole generation of people didn't get that reference. but it's true of you. Discontentment is dangerous. Now from here, Paul says something that you have heard before, but maybe you haven't fully wrestled with. He goes on to say, for the love of money. And let me stop there. You know what? Most of us think that Paul is talking to somebody else. When Paul writes this, we think, well, he's talking about the person next to me, or he's talking about the person behind me, or he's talking about the person in front of me. We rarely think when we read this verse that Paul is talking about us. And here's why. The love of money is very, very difficult to see in the mirror. Because we have all kinds of rationale and all kinds of justifications and all kinds of this, and we don't think it really is what it really is. So let me kind of help you try to figure out for a moment if Paul's talking to you here. And let me do it by this illustration. How many of you have ever been in love? Wow, there's some of you might be in trouble after today. But what I want you to do is I want you to, for like all of us except for that one person that wasn't paying attention, that didn't raise their hand but should have, and now there's a weird awkward conversation you're going to have after church. But for those of you who've been in love before, maybe it was your first love, or maybe you started dating somebody, you fell in love, ended up marrying them. But I want you to think back to a time when you were in love. When you think back to that time, can you think back to a moment or something you did because you were in love that was kind of dumb? Like when you look back, you're like, man, that was stupid. That was like really foolish and even reckless. When my wife, Stacy, and I were dating, I did something, and I won't elaborate because this is being recorded, but I did something that literally I could have gotten fired for and kicked out of college at the same time, just so I could have a 20-minute conversation with her. I mean, I look back on it, I'm like, how stupid. Like I was acting like if my life couldn't go on if I didn't have this 20-minute and I risked so much for it. Now let me ask you guys a different question, and I don't want you to raise your hand. Have you ever done something that when you look back, in order to get something, in order to buy something, that as you look back you thought to yourself, man, that was really dumb. That was really stupid. Man, that was so reckless. That was so foolish. Why would I do that? And maybe as you look back on it, you went to great lengths to get it. Maybe you strained relationships, maybe you damaged relationships that haven't recovered, or maybe you had to manipulate numbers and convince people and convince yourself. But can you think back to a time when you did something stupid with your money in order to get something? Something you look back and you go, dang, that was really dumb. Well, if you have a story like that, I want you to know that in that moment you were in love with money and stuff. And you probably still are trying to convince yourself you weren't, but I'm telling you, you were. And you may still be. And here's what Paul says about all that. He says, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And if you've ever done something dumb for stuff or money, you know that's true, right? Some people, and Paul's going to an extreme here. He says, look, this happens to some people who fall in love with money. He says, some people eager for money. You ever been eager for something? You ever been eager for a house? Eager for a car? Eager for new clothes? Eager for a new phone? Eager for a new computer? Eager for new hunting gear? Eager for a new gun? You ever been eager for something? Some people, eager for money, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Paul says, look, discontentment is dangerous. It doesn't just cost us our financial future. It doesn't just cost us relationships. For some of us, it may even do irreparable damage to our faith. And by the way, some of you are here today and you have lived that truth. Because you used to come to church. You used to be super regular. And then you drifted off. Not because of bad theology, not because philosophical differences, but you drifted off because life happened. You were pursuing things, even if that thing you were pursuing was a club sports team or whatever it is, but you were pursuing things, and now you're back. And as you look back on all of that, you realize, wow, that really happened. And Paul predicted that 2,000 years ago. So from here he says, but you. In other words, it doesn't have to be that way. There's another way. But you, man of God or woman of God, flee. Now say that word with me all together. Flee. You know what flee doesn't mean? Be careful. Paul isn't saying here, hey, be careful with the pursuit of more. He's not saying be careful with the pursuit of stuff. He's saying run. Run like your life depends on it. Run from all of this. What's the this that Paul's talking about? The pursuit of more. The love of more. The love of bigger, better, faster, stronger, newer, shinier. And then what Paul does is nothing short of brilliant. Because what Paul does from here is he gives us the antidote. He gives us the thing that if we will do this, that it will help us to address the dissatisfaction that drives our overspending. He says, flee from this, flee from the pursuit of more, and then he says, pursue. So he's telling Timothy, look, Timothy, here's how you do this. Here's how you address this. And by the way, Timothy, down the road, as you pastor more people and you lead people and what it looks like to follow me, I want you to tell people to do this too, but pursue. Become less aware of one thing and more aware of something else. Become less discontent around one thing and be more discontent around something else. Timothy, the way to overcome this stuff is to change your pursuit. Pursue something else. And he gives them some details. Pursue righteousness, pursue godliness, pursue faith, pursue love, pursue endurance, and pursue gentleness. The way that we bridle our discontentment is to redirect our pursuit. Contentment is found when we redirect our pursuit. So how do you and I do that? What exactly does this look like? What might it look like? Well, a few verses later, Paul kind of gives some details. He says, command them to do good and be rich in good deeds. In other words, what Paul's sort of saying is, look, all that time and all that energy that we spend looking on websites or walking through stores looking for something to want or need, what if we took that same time and that same energy and we found someone that had a need, or we found a need in this world and we started doing something about that? What if we volunteered that time and energy? And then he continues and he says, and to be generous. And this is how God might speak to some of you in this room. Maybe you're here and there's this thing you've wanted. Not because you needed it, but because you wanted it. Now, you've convinced yourself you need it, and you have a long list of reasons that sound very convincing, at least to you and probably the people around you, but the bottom line is you don't need it, you just want it. And you've done everything that you could, everything that you can to try to find the extra money. I need $200 more a month and I can get that thing. And you found it. But Paul is suggesting, look, instead of spending $200 in the pursuit of more, for the love of more, what if you took that $200 and you gave it to somebody who needs it? What if you found somebody who needs it worse than you? And then he says, and this may be tough, and be willing to share. You know what the problem is with buying things new? At least one of the problems buying new things. And I don't know if this works this way for you, but it definitely works this way for me. I have a hard time sharing things that I just bought. Now, if you want to borrow my old, ragged out, used thing, sure, absolutely, here you go. Do you need me to drop it off at the house for you? I'll help you with that. But if you ask me to borrow something that I just bought, I start to go, I don't know about that. Right? Paul says, look, new pursuit. Be willing to share. And how he finishes is extraordinarily important. He goes on to say, in this way, and when he says they, he's talking about you and me. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that, and what we're about to read is nothing short of awesome, so that they may take hold of and don't miss this, life that is truly life. What Paul's telling Timothy and you and me is, here's what he's saying. If we live our life in the pursuit of more, if we live our life and we fall in love with more, if stuff starts to define our life for us, then what we will end up doing is we will end up pursuing things that we think will give us real, true, meaningful life. The things that people have told us will give us life. Things that have been sold to us as this will give you life. But what we will discover at the end of it is that what we end up with is absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's just a house of cards. So Paul says, look, redirect your pursuit. Stop being discontent about one thing and be discontent about another. Find a way to be less aware of one thing and more aware of something else. And Paul insists this is what great gain looks like. So I have 4 questions. 4 questions that I think every one of us should wrestle with. Here's the first one. What creates material discontentment in you? Because we all have a thing. None of us are exempt. We have a thing. For some of us, it's a house. For some of us, it's cars. For some of us, it's gadgets. For some of us, it's clothes. For some of us, it's hunting gear. You realize every week I get a text after these messages and somebody goes, hey, that's true of everything except for guns, right? For some of us, it's guns. But what's your thing? And what fuels your discontentment? Is it a magazine? Is it a store? Is it a website? What is it? What's your thing and what fuels it? Next question. What can you do to become less aware? Maybe you need to cancel the subscription. Maybe you need to decide you're not going to go to the website. Maybe you need to stay away from dealerships. Maybe, like me, you need to stay away from Home Depot. I went in there yesterday for one thing, and I walked out with 6 things I wanted. Things I didn't even know. I was like, you can do that? That's amazing. Maybe some of you just need to stay away from Home Depot. But what can you do to become less aware? Which brings me to my next question. What could you do this week to become more aware of what someone else doesn't have? And when I say more aware of what someone else doesn't have, I mean to the point that it bothers you. And when I say to the point that it bothers you, I don't mean that where you go, oh, that stinks for them, kind of tough luck for them, but to the point where it bothers you, where you decide, no, this can't stand, something has to be done, I'm going to do something. My last question. What should you become more discontented over in your life? For some of you, it may be a marriage that doesn't honor God. For some of you, it could be that you're not managing your finances in a way that honors God. For some of you, it could be that there's no intimacy in your relationship with God. For some of you, maybe the thing you should be discontent over is the fact that you've been a Christian for quite a while now, but technically you don't know what you believe or why you believe it. And if someone were to ask you, you couldn't tell them. What should you become more discontent over in your life? And then what would it look like if you redirected that energy? What would it look like if you redirected your pursuit? For some of you, you may sign up for one of the financial growth groups that we have that are going to be offered after this series. My wife will tell you a little bit more about it later. For some of you, it may mean that the thing you need to do to redirect your pursuit is just to make Sunday morning, church on Sunday morning, a non-optional activity. Something that you're going to put on your calendar in ink. And you're going to decide, we're doing this, regardless of whether it rains, regardless of how tired I am, regardless of how hungover I am from the night before. Maybe for some of you, the way that you should redirect your energy is by actually diving into Scripture, reading it on a daily basis, and trying to figure out what you believe and why you believe it. But here's what I want you to know. Discontentment is dangerous, and it will get you unbalanced financially. So constant correction requires an intentional move in a different direction. We find contentment when we redirect our pursuit. And along the way, what we also find is not just contentment, but life that is truly life. So don't sell yourself short. Pursue great gain.